head into our third and final session, which is on nuclear power. And I know we've already had a couple of questions come in on nuclear power, so we'll make sure to get to those before we close. So for this session, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Jim Green. Jim, if you could just switch your camera back on so I know you're definitely still here. Brilliant, thank you. So Jim Green is the anti-nuclear campaigner with Friends of the Earth Australia and is also the former editor of the, where is it? Nuclear Monitor, thank you, David, newsletter. And we also have Dr. Ian Fairley, who is an independent consultant on radiation in the environment, whose doctoral studies examine the health effects of nuclear waste technologies. And he's an independent consultant to organisations such as the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Again, I'm not sure, I can't remember who exactly is going first, but I'm sure you will have figured it out between you two, and I'll let you fire away.
Well, Jim, do you want to go first, or will I push the vote out?
You go first, Ian.
Okay. Hello to everyone, and thank you to Iona and to Lynn for their involvement in this seminar. It's a good one. I'm going to be talking today for about 10-15 minutes on where we are in the UK with the push for nuclear developments. Although we're in Scotland right now, the reality is that all of the push for nuclear power, which is quite evident in the UK, comes from the Westminster government in London. It's true that there is a rather complicated relationship between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Very interesting. But formally, the Scottish government, based in Edinburgh, is opposed to new nuclear developments, whereas Westminster government in London is pushing very strongly for them. Energy issues are not devolved issues, therefore decisions can be taken in Westminster which affect Scotland with impunity, basically. It's true that planning permission for nuclear developments remains within the purview of Edinburgh, but the big decisions, basically policy decisions, are taken in Westminster. Now, unfortunately, the current government, this is having to do with nuclear policy now, the current Westminster government is pursuing what they call an energy policy, which is, in my view, incoherent and inconsistent and borders on downright lunacy in many ways. Let me give you a couple of examples for our colleagues in Australia. First of all, the government has been putting out white papers stating categorically that nuclear power is cheaper than the renewables, despite hundreds of studies which show exactly the opposite. In addition, there are statements by promoters of nuclear power in Britain stating that the nuclear industry in Britain is running smoothly. And this is utterly contradictory to the real situation, whereby over 60%, put it the other way around, only 60% of the nuclear facilities in Britain are actually operating. The other 40% are shut down for various reasons. In addition to this, let me give an example that about a week ago, a Scottish reactor, reactor 3 at Hudderston B, closed down for good. And that was utterly, utterly ignored in the whole of the British media. Similarly, reactor 4, there are 2 reactors at Henderson B. Reactor 4 will be closing down early January next year. So the whole station will be shut down for good. None of this is reported in the media, and is ignored by the UK government as well. But there's many other things. For example, the government, in its recent policy statements on nuclear, alleges that there will be lots of support for its planned expansion at Sizewell in East Anglia and Britain. Well, that's exactly opposite of what the situation is. Just to give examples, the situation is in the rest of the world, they are pulling out of nuclear developments rather than developing them. To give examples, if you look at Toshiba and its plans in Cumbria and Hitachi, where the plans are WOVA, both of them kiboshed because of the sheer impracticality and lack of good economics involved in their plans. And yet the government here in Britain, the Westminster government that is, wants a big expansion of nuclear developments. What can you say about this? Is myopia, blindness? I mean, many of the statements made by the government are just incredulous. And this has an unfortunate effect on, how would I say, the anti-nuclear organizations in Britain. I have to say that many people are demoralized by the continual onslaught going on in Britain. And opposition to nuclear seems to be quite muted. I have myself put out on my blog statements to the contrary, saying that people shouldn't be demoralized and that there's a huge gulf between what the government says and what it actually does. Many of the statements put out by the government are backed by little evidence or by little promises of support. So we should really be, how would I put it, at the very best quizzical and at the worst, downright opposed to what the government is saying. I should mention to our colleagues in Australia that the government in Britain is led by a gentleman called Boris Johnson, who is widely disparaged and widely disliked in the UK and in, funny enough, in the rest of the world too. Boris Johnson was, in fact, formerly the mayor of London, when his record at the mayor of London is one marked by many, how would I put it, misadventures, shall we say kindly. Boris Johnson was also the foreign secretary, and he was widely pilloried by the rest of the world as being the worst foreign secretary in Britain's history. Their quotes, not mine. And now he's, unbelievably, he's the prime minister. And his record is one of mishaps, U-turns, policy misadventures, and backtracking. Mr. U-turn, he's often called. So my statement to the people who are watching is, don't be just downhearted by what the British Prime Minister is saying. He's got a very bad record of actually implementing his suggestions and policy maneuvers. I would say hold tight and watch for the time being. I mean, there are many other areas whereby the government's policies are, how shall I say, full of misadventures. Just to give an example, that the British government Westminster, is saying that by the year 2050, in its energy projections, that the amount of electricity being generated in Britain will have to increase by 25%. And very little credence is given to any energy demand management requirements. On the other hand, if you look at other countries, like, for example, Germany across the water, which is, of course, much more economically powerful than Britain, it has, for the same year, 2050, its electricity projections are for a 25% decline. And it will do this by very stringent energy demand measures. So you've got the two countries, on the one hand, Germany, and on the one hand, Britain, which come to diametrically opposed projections for electricity demand. And this is really important in terms of where Britain goes as regards its energy policy. If you look at the German scenarios, they are, well, they're much more carefully thought out with long reports. And more importantly, they are subscribed to by the main political parties in Germany. Here in Britain, the policies sketched in by the government department involved, BEIS it's called, are flimsy, short, long on rhetoric and short on any analysis. It makes you embarrassed to be British in many ways. There's the lack of intellectual rigor involved in Britain's energy policies, so-called policies. Now, one more example I want to give to you, and that is that the British government is proposing a major expansion at Sizewell C. And in its white paper on the matter, it says that there will be lots of support from others, in addition to the government putting money in. Well, this is just poppycock, it's nonsense. There isn't any. It's exactly the opposite. The major companies throughout the world are actually pulling out. The only areas where there are nuclear developments being proposed is in countries with centralized dictatorships, i.e. Russia and China. And the rest, now with one exception, that's France, it's the other way around, that nuclear is in full retreat. This is shown in the excellent World Nuclear Industry Status Report for 2021, which I would recommend people download and read. Now, I'm very conscious of the fact that I've been pouring, my report is a negative one. I've been pouring scorn on passive policy here in Britain. And it doesn't give me any joy to do this. It's being too negative can oftentimes be a prescription in itself, and it keeps on going down. And I don't like that. But I'm afraid that one also has to be realistic. One also has to keep one's eyes open about what actually really is happening. And I'm afraid in Britain, it is, it's not a very pretty picture for energy policy. I'm willing to answer any questions which may arise, but I'm going to stop there for the time being and allow Jim to present perhaps a more positive report.
Thank you very much, Ian. Yeah, we'll take, I'm aware there's been some questions rolling in for you, and there was also a question right at the beginning of the event on this topic. So I'm going to let Jim come in, and then we'll take all the questions towards the end.
Thanks, Iona, and thanks for that, Ian. Hopefully this will be more positive. Firstly, to acknowledge the Kaurna traditional owners here in Adelaide in South Australia, and to note that sovereignty was never ceded. South Australia was the host for 9 of the 12 British bomb tests hosted in Australia. We're home to the only 2 operating uranium mines in Australia, namely Beverley 4 Mile which is on Adnyamathanha country, and also the Olympic Dam mine, also known as Roxby Downs. An area of South Australia is being targeted for a national nuclear waste dump. And we recently learned that nuclear powered submarines will be built in South Australia. So we've got a lot on our plate. I want to very briefly touch on the nuclear connections between the UK and Australia, just to outline them. Of course, this starts with the British bomb tests. We not only hosted the tests, but we supplied uranium, which was converted into plutonium, and those plutonium bombs were dropped here in Australia, mostly in South Australia. Australia hoped to get a nuclear power reactor in return for hosting those bomb tests, but all we got was a small research reactor. That research reactor and subsequent research reactors have been operated by the Australian Energy Commission, the Atomic Energy Commission, which was later renamed ANSTO, or the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, at a site called Lucas Heights. That research reactor was probably used for weapons research, and there's no doubt that the Atomic Energy Commission was up to its neck in the push for nuclear weapons in Australia. Amongst other things, the Atomic Energy Commission had a secret uranium enrichment research program operating in the basement of a building at Lucas Heights. This was called the Whistle Project. The Atomic Energy Commission was also involved in Jervis Bay, and Jervis Bay was Australia's most serious push for a nuclear power reactor, and it was defeated. But we know that the push for nuclear power at Jervis Bay was underpinned by a hidden weapons agenda, because the Prime Minister of the day, John Gorton, later admitted quite clearly that there was a hidden weapons agenda. Anyway, Jervis Bay was cancelled. We have no nuclear power in Australia. We have federal and state legal bans which prohibit the development of nuclear power in Australia. The two major political parties, namely the Coalition and the Labor Party, are both committed to maintaining those legal bans. So in some respects, we're in a good position, and clearly a much better position than the one that Ian just outlined in the UK. And here in South Australia, we're actually a world leader in the development of solar and wind. Solar and wind supply 62% of our electricity. We will be at 100% net renewables by the year 2030. We're having no great problems. It's certainly not proving to be expensive. So all the fear mongering we get from the nuclear lobby and others about renewable energy, a lot of those claims are being disproven right here in South Australia. I'll go on to mention a couple of other connections. We had the bomb tests. We got the research reactor from the UK. The spent nuclear fuel from the Lucas Heights research reactor was sent to Dounreay in Scotland over 50 years ago, and the reprocessing waste is scheduled to be returned to Australia next year. Another connection is that BNFL, British Nuclear Fuels Limited, was behind the failed push by Pangaea Resources to turn Australia into the world's dump for high-level nuclear waste. That all took place about 20 years ago. It was very unpopular in Australia and didn't last long. And I suspect that the British nuclear industry was also delighted when plans to turn Australia, and specifically South Australia, into the world's nuclear waste dump resurfaced 5 years ago in the context of the South Australian Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission. But once again, that proposal was fairly quickly knocked on the head by public opposition, with Aboriginal traditional owners leading that opposition. And yet another connection between Australia and the UK is that Australian uranium fuels British nuclear power plants. So Australian origin nuclear material is contained in the nuclear waste stored at nuclear power plants, in the waste at Sellafield, and most likely in the waste dumped at Drigg and elsewhere in the UK. Now, I do want to finish on a positive note, and this is to pluck out a few highlights from a report we're releasing in the next week or two It's called Nuclear Power's Economic Crisis. And I guess a starting point for this would be to compare where we are now to where we were a decade ago, when there was the first rumblings of a nuclear renaissance, and the number of nuclear power reaction starts was on a fairly sharp increase. It didn't last long. It started in the late 2000s and it was essentially killed off by Fukushima. But the points I want to pull out of this report, firstly, every nuclear power reactor construction project in Western Europe and North America over the past decade has been a disaster, every single one of them. Whenever I make these points, people accuse me of cherry picking, but this is every single project. The VC Summer project in South Carolina was abandoned after the expenditure of around $9 billion US. The Vogtle project in the US state of Georgia is 6 years behind schedule and costs have doubled. Hinkley was meant to be 2 billion British pounds per reactor. The latest cost estimate is 11 to 12 billion pounds per reactor. So those costs are up by a factor of 5 or 6. EDF was saying they would build these reactors in the space of 3 years. I'm sure you remember EDF saying that you'd be cooking your Christmas turkeys by the year 2017 using new EPR reactors in the UK, but construction hadn't even begun then. The only reactor construction project in France is 10 years behind schedule, and the current cost estimate is a mind-boggling 19.1 billion euros, which in Australian dollars is over $30 billion. And that's nearly 6 times the original cost estimate. And the reactor under construction in Finland is 13 years behind schedule. And the current cost estimate is 3.7 times greater than the original cost estimate. So it's been an absolute disaster. And of course, in the UK, the Wilfer project was abandoned despite billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars being on offer. Moorside was cancelled for this, despite the same billion-dollar subsidies on offer. And lastly, I want to finish with a couple of comments on every single small modular reactor, or SMR, construction project in the world. And again, I'm not cherry picking. This is the entire list. There's only a handful of them. There's one under construction in Argentina. It's 7 years behind schedule. The cost has increased by a factor of 23. Cost estimate is equivalent to 23 billion Australian dollars per gigawatt. Russia's floating nuclear power plant is said to be the only operating SMR in the world, even though it doesn't really meet the definition. It was 9 years behind schedule, more than 6 times over budget, and the OECD estimates that the electricity it produces costs $200 US per megawatt hour, which means it's wildly uncompetitive as a conventional electricity source. There's a high temperature gas-cooled SMR under construction in China. They're pretty much finished but haven't begun operating. 8 years behind schedule. They've abandoned plans for more of these reactors at the same site. The cost is 2 to 3 times higher than the initial estimate, and hopes that this SMR could produce cheaper electricity than large nuclear plants have been dashed. China also recently began construction of a conventional light water SMR. And according to the China National Nuclear Corporation, construction costs per kilowatt will be twice the cost of large reactors, and the levelized cost of electricity will be 50% higher than large reactors. And finally, Russia began construction of a SMR based on fast reactor technology. It was expected to be complete in the year 2020, but it didn't even begin construction until this year. And the construction cost estimate has more than doubled. So I think there's a lot of good news there. I could have spent more time talking about some of the bad news here in South Australia, not least this plan for nuclear powered submarines, which really turns our nuclear debate on its head and is deeply troubling for lots of reasons. But anyway, there's some positive news for you, Ian. And I'll finish there, Iona.
Thank you, Jim. That's great. Yeah, no, I mean, there's not too many positives to be drawn, but I actually think both of you have drawn out a couple of things. I was chatting to Ian last week, and Ian is actually the person that told me about the reactor at Hunterston, closing. And yeah, it sounds like your report is going to be another good piece of something positive that we can put out there. So please do send us it when it is out there, and we will get it fired around. So we've had a few questions coming in on the chat and the Q&A. I'm going to start with one which I think is, I'm not sure if it's directed to one or both of you, but it's possible that you could both answer, which was, what are the implications of rising ocean temperatures on water-cooled reactors?
Yeah, I'll start with this, Jim, if it's okay with you, unless you want to answer.
No, you go, Ian.
Yeah, this is an important matter. The reality is that that we are seeing evidence from various reports of that the rise in sea level is real and that it seems to be accelerating. It's not very good news for us all, for the whole of humanity. And amongst the effects of that will be effects on nuclear power stations throughout the world, majority of which are based on coastlines. This will cause real problems for them. Not to say flooding, for example, and also the fact that if the temperatures of seawaters continues to rise, this will have an adverse impact on the cooling ability of seawater to cool reactors. Now, I haven't actually seen a disparate academic analysis of these matters. And so therefore my comments are a bit hesitant, but it would seem from the weather reports that I've been reading about that this could be a serious, well, this is a serious issue. Of course, certainly in Britain anyway, the government doesn't want to know anything about this and steadily ignores the matter. But I think that it will be a serious matter for energy policy. I should say also, by the way, that rising sea levels is not just an issue for nuclear reactors. There are many other aspects, including the very existence of many islands in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. So we have to get these things in perspective a little bit. But rising sea levels will obviously impact on existing nuclear reactors. I think I'm pretty sure of that. I hope that helps. Jim, do you want to add anything?
Well, just to note an obvious point, but there's a range of climate impacts. It's not just rising sea levels, it's also storms and floods and warming water resources, dwindling water resources. And I'm sure you're familiar with reactors either being taken offline or put into reduced power because of warming water and dwindling water resources. That's a recurring problem in the northern summers. And just to note, I'll put in the link, a presentation by Dr. Paul Dorfman, given just a few days ago, which I think covers this issue well. And on the same video link, there's a really good talk by MV Ramana about small modular reactors, and another really good talk by Dr. Edwin Lyman about so-called advanced or generation 4 nuclear reactors.
Yes, I would recommend the reports by Ramana at the University of British Columbia and by Ed Lyman at the Union of Concerned Scientists, both good guys. By the way, to put a bit of levity or lightness into this matter, because it's deadly serious. About a year ago, a number of Canadians, led by Romana, UBC, had a little competition to devise other meanings for the acronym SMR. We all think it means small modular reactors, but we all know that it's extremely misleading because in most cases they're not small, and in most cases they're not modular. And there was a very good response to this little competition. And the best one was simply more radiation. So whenever you see SMR, put in brackets after that, simply more radiation, because it quite rightly punctures the self-regard of the people who say SMRs, and squarely puts forward the view that here we go again, more radiation, more radioactivity. It's I know, Iona, that it's not how would I put it, a serious matter or a serious contribution, but I hope it brings a smile to your face.
Certainly does. All right, we have, so there was a question, again directed straight back at yourself, Ian, to do with campaigning around trying to bring the occupational and public ionizing radiation exposure limits into line with the evidence of the risks, and where can that campaign go next? Yeah,
I've actually replied to it.
I know, but I think it's nice for everyone to be able to hear, even if you respond in person.
Tony Webb has formerly lived in the UK many years ago, and Tony and I, in the good old days, used to campaign on the radiation issue, on the standards and levels, safety levels, which were enforced then, and indeed, basically, Tony's point is that recent evidence is now showing that that the current limits for exposure to radiation are way out of line with what the evidence shows. That the risks, the evidence shows that the risks shows that radiation is much more serious than we think it is. The effects of radiation, in terms of cancers and birth defects, and nowadays also cardiovascular risks as well. I totally agree with Tony's views that we should really be campaigning on this issue. Unfortunately, there are very few people around who are actually doing anything on this. There isn't a great deal of awareness of the problems involved here. Should any of the people who are listening in wish have an interest in this matter, please send me an email and I will send you a copy of a 70-page, report, which I prepared for a UK charity, which they have gracefully allowed me to send to other people, which discusses radiation risks in quite some detail. That's about the best I can say.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian. And yes, I'm sure we can get that sent out to anybody that would like a copy. There's a question here from David. I'm going to direct this one to Jim. So looking at investments from the UK government to Rolls-Royce for research and for a new range of power plants, and money looking into tidal power. If there's no justification for nuclear power plants other than their support for the nuclear weapons industry, as a country that doesn't currently have a nuclear power industry, how do we get this message out?
Well, I'm not sure I've got a really good answer to that, but the first point I would make is that the money that the British government is offering Rolls-Royce is a lot. Obviously, I think it's 200+ million with a matching amount from Rolls-Royce or from the private sector. But, you know, that's not enough to build their first plant, let alone their second or the 10th or anything. They're still going to be scratching around for a long time to get the funding to build their first plant. So as to the reasons for it, well, you know, I could speak to Australia, the level of nuclear support in Australia. Number one is ignorance. Second is commercial interests. And in Australia, that might be direct nuclear commercial interests plus indirect interests, whereby the fossil fuel industry sees that promoting nuclear power is a good way to slow the transition to renewables. And thirdly, the culture wars, and that's very prominent in Australia. Most of the support for nuclear power comes from the Murdoch media, who see it in the context of culture wars, and also from the extreme right-wing politicians. So that's how it plays out in Australia, but I'm sure that Ian and others could give a better answer for the UK.
Well, no, we would exactly the same answer applies to Britain. Culture wars are prevalent here, and the Murdoch empire doesn't end in the shores of Australia by any means. Murdoch owns major elements of the UK media, and in fact, the media in this country are a major problem for getting anything done. I think it's fair to say that Britain probably has the worst mainstream media in the world, and the Murdoch titles fit in with that. So I'm sorry, it's a bit of a moan about what's going on in Britain again, but there we go, it's true. If you look at the major titles in Britain today, the Mail, the Express, the Times, they're all terrible rags. And the how shall I say, the incorrect statements, the harassment of public people, the lies, the misogyny, and are just such a daily outpouring that it makes me wonder, it really does. And sooner or later, we're going to have politicians from any political party are going to have to address this. Sorry, that's my end of my diatribe. I'll end there.
Thank you, Ian. Our next question is from Gillian, in talking about some of the fear-mongering and the misinformation that gets peddled particularly within education resources that are appearing in curriculums. And the question is this happening elsewhere, and are they being systemically challenged? I'll let you guys come in, but first of all, just to say that it's equally depressing here. We maybe not equally, but it's you know, a similarly grim situation here in that, you know, you're just going up against organizations that have so much more funding than the sort of the challengers do. Certainly, yeah, we've got vibrant memories of the Scottish Learning Festival conference in Glasgow a couple of years ago, where we've got our little Peace Education Scotland stall that does awareness in schools around nuclear explosions, nuclear tests, nuclear weapons. And about 3 stalls down from us is an absolutely enormous entire corner, all devoted to getting kids internships at the nuclear power stations and getting the nuclear power agenda into schools. So in terms of, I'm not an official educator, so I'm not sure in terms of education policy and the curriculum and what's being done to challenge that, but certainly as a sort of a small charity trying to counteract that, it can often feel very sort of dispowering as well. But that's why it's so important that we keep doing it and that we keep getting in there. And it's entirely possible that bits and pieces of this event will make it into a Peace Education Scotland module at some point to provide evidence and do a bit of work in schools. Do Ian and Jim want to come in on that one as well?
I don't really have anything to add, but I wonder if Gillian might want to say something about it from her experience working in the university sector.
Yeah, well, it's certainly come to my attention that you know, there is a big emphasis on I guess standardizing what's taught in schools across Australia. There's an increasing emphasis on that. So the national curriculum and the national policies around teaching and learning in schools is becoming more and more standardized at a national level. And yeah, I noticed that the nuclear industry and government are definitely increasing the volume and the presence of pro-nuclear information into our schools. So they're offering scholarships. They've got an online package of curriculum materials that's readily available, free of use, you know, from reception through to year 12 that teachers can tap into. And yeah, I find it really concerning that that this isn't being challenged in any way, either within the education system itself or through you know, any type of concern that that parents and schools might be having around the push to engage with this sort of industry and industry resourcing. And I noticed that it popped up very conspicuously at the time when the waste dump proposal was very prominent for a possible location at Wallabadina in our country, and now it's also turned up very prominently in the curriculum that's being rolled out in local schools across Eyre Peninsula, where the Kimber proposed site is. So they're being quite strategic about targeting those particular communities where this is possibly going to gain momentum. And yeah, the schools are taking this on board without any question, and so is the education department. So obviously the industry and government are in this for the long term. They're happy to wait and educate the next generation of young people into believing that the nuclear industry is safe and viable and the way for the future. So I think that, yeah, somewhere along the track, it would be really good to have some sort of strategy that we could all tap into that would help speak back to that.
Thank you, Gillian. And I think you've left us at a really great place in terms of how are we going to fix all this? How are we going to solve it? Education, you know, really make sure that whoever's taking on the mantle after we're all done is doing it from the best informed place that they possibly can be.